Chains, Chapter 34. Sunday, November 17th through Sunday, November 24th, 1776. We have now got near 5,000 prisoners in New York, and many of them are such ragamuffins as you never saw in your life. Letter of a British officer published in the London Packet newspaper. I had no time to ponder Curzon's fate. Madam commanded that a supper be thrown to celebrate the capture of Fort Washington, complete with turtle soup. The house fair exploded with dust and activity. The junior officers cleared out their cots, clothing, and maps from the second-floor drawing room so we could scrub and polish it from ceiling to floor. The kitchen hearth was crowded with irons heating to press the tablecloths and serviettes. Madam hired the cook from the city tavern to prepare the meal. Folks said they had a way with turtles. She then chose the prettiest of the soldier wives to wait at the tables. The ugly ones and Sarah with her big belly were to stay in the kitchen to assist the cook and wash up. My job was to ferry the food up the stairs and the dirty crockery down. The food began arriving long before sunup, packed into crates and hauled by sleepy-eyed boys. 3 turtles, each the size of a footstool, came in a wooden pen. The sound of their flippers scratching made Sarah yelp in fright. 2 of the turtles kept their heads tight against their shells. The third stretched out his neck and watched the commotion with wet, solemn eyes. While we scurried to finish the house and the cook butchered the turtles and plucked the pheasants, the hairdresser arrived to tend to Madam. He spent hours applying pomatum wax, padding, and lengths of brick-colored hair to fashion a high roll on Madam's head. The hair swept off her brow and soared into the air like a wave curling before a ship's prow. I thought the wave might crumble, but Madam did not ask my opinion. She wanted a pot of hot chocolate made with 2 handfuls of sugar, which was a shocking amount. Sarah and the cook were exchanging heated words in the kitchen. Empty turtle shells stood drying in the corner, and the cook's assistant stirred the thick soup, bubbling over the fire. I grabbed the chocolate pot and left, not wanting to see what became of the poor creatures' heads. As I served the hot chocolate and tidied the chamber, Madam rubbed her face with Venetian bloom water, beauty wash, said to remove wrinkles. After that came a layer of Molyneux's Italian paste to make her skin white as bleached linen. It made her resemble a corpse. And then the final triumph. She used a tiny brush to paint a thin line of glue above each eye. Madam opened an envelope and shook out 2 gray strips of mouse fur, each cut into an arch. Leaning toward the mirror, she glued the mouse fur onto her own eyebrows, making them bushy and thick, as the fashion required. In truth, she looked like a woman with 2 lumps of mouse fur stuck to her face. A delicate bell sounded overhead, Lady Seymour summoning help. "The guests will be arriving soon," Madam said, admiring her reflection. "Aunt Seymour wishes to be seated in advance of them. You may assist her." After I helped the lady limp from her chamber to her place near the head of the long table, I placed a foot warmer filled with hot coals under her chair and spread a woolen blanket on her lap. She thanked me kindly and looked about. "When I was young, we dined thus every night," she said with a sigh. I could scarce credit it. The table was covered by the finest linen tablecloth I'd ever seen. Each place had china plates, crystal glasses, and ivory-handled knives and forks. Candles were positioned every 3 hands, salt cellars each with a tiny spoon, and pepper mills were set in easy arm's reach of each place. Smaller tables and sideboards were positioned at the edges of the room to hold trays and dishes. One table was covered with wine bottles. Candlelight reflected back and back again in the polished mirrors that hung from the walls. I caught a glimpse in the hearth mirror of a girl with a mark on her cheek that trumpeted her shame. I quickly turned my eyes away. There was a heavy knock on the front door. "It begins," Lady Seymour said. Go below, child. I set the tray loaded with the turtle soup bowls on the table by the door. 3 more trays needed to be brought up the stairs, but I allowed myself a quick peek at the company before I fetched them. The table was crowded with officers wearing splendid uniforms and perfectly powdered wigs, along with several of Master Lockton's business companions. Lockton wore a cardinal red satin waistcoat, black satin coat and breeches, and shoes with silver buckles. The new clothes could not hide the fact that the master was grinding himself down with work. Long hours serving the British commandant had melted off the fat from his second and third chins and created heavy black circles under his eyes. But his bags of gold grew fatter, and that was what he cared for the most. Madame reigned over her end of the table with the occasional flutter of her fan, the wave of hair above her brow threatening to crash at any moment. Lady Seymour, the only other woman present, looked like an elegant spider wrapped in her black lace shawl. Her eyes were lively in the candlelight, and her cheeks had color in them for the first time in weeks. The officer next to her was the size and shape of Edward, the shaggy bull who lived down the road from us in Rhode Island. The man did not have a ring in his nose, but he laughed with an impatient snorting sound. I hurried up and down the stairs with the remaining trays of soup, then the roasted tongue and mushrooms. The serving girl cut the meat on Lady Seymour's plate before setting it down so that the weakness of her arm would not hinder her. The young soldier who was appointed wine steward danced around the backs of the guests, keeping their glasses full. The conversating flowed as fast as the wine, the taking of Fort Washington, news from London, plans for a fox hunt. At this last, an officer joked that the next fox would be a tall sort from Virginia by the name of George Washington. That caused hearty laughter all around, and glasses raised. A serving girl hissed at me to go back to the kitchen. When I entered the room a half hour later, my arms shook under the weight of the tray. The cook had prepared enough to feed a battalion: pheasant stuffed with figs, stewed oysters, potted larks, greens cooked with bacon, pickled watermelon rind, and buttered parsnips. The pheasant smelled good. I had hopes that some might find its way into the scraps bucket. By the time I lugged in the dessert tray, rice pudding, lemon biscuits, 2 creamed pear tarts, and an iced cake, the fire was blazing and the room much warmer. Lockton had freed the top buttons of his waistcoat, and 2 of the officers had loosened their lace neckcloths. The heat had softened the glue of Madame's left mousy eyebrow, and it had begun to free itself from her face. She did not notice this. The serving girls and wine steward watched the progress of the eyebrow and fought to keep the smiles from their faces. The voices of the men were loud and booming, as if the wine they drank affected their hearing. I handed a plate of tart to one of the serving women, who carried it to the table and set it in front of Colonel Hawkins. "So how many rebel prisoners did your men bag, Colonel?" asked Master Lockton. I passed another dish of tart. The colonel shook his head. "Near 3,000 of the devils. Wish we could have shot them all." My hand shook as I reached for the third. "Why so?" Lockton asked. "We've no place to put them." The colonel pushed tart to the side and reached into the bowl of shelled almonds in the middle of the table. He tossed a few into his mouth and crunched loudly. "I thought you were using the bridewell," Lockton said. "That should provide ample space." The general snorted and shook his head. "The prison is so stuffed the walls are ready to burst. We've had to pack them into the sugar houses and the confiscated churches, too." He reached for more nuts. "It's a right nuisance. Never thought we'd have so many." "I'd say so many prisoners are a badge of honor for your men and the king," Lockton said. The colonel raised an eyebrow. "We do not need a badge of honor. We need a decent plague to take them off our hands." The men around the table chuckled. "The expense of feeding them will be staggering." "The rebels planted the seeds of war. Let them enjoy their harvest." Lockton ate a forkful of tart. force the local patriots to feed them." "I say shoot 'em," growled the man who looked like Edward the Bull. "Course then we have to dispose of the bodies. Messy work, that." "Waste of ammunition," the colonel said, "and some members of Parliament would fuss like wet hens. No, I predict a cold winter will dispatch most of them in a natural way." Lady Seymour spoke up. "What if the rebels decide that turnabout is fair play? We need to care for them so they do not harm their British captives." "With all due respect, ma'am," the man said with a smile, "the rebels would first have to capture a prisoner. Given their blunders, it is an unlikely prospect." Lady Seymour nodded gravely. "What of the prisoners they took after their victory at Breed's Hill?" The table fell very still at that. Talk of what happened at Breed's Hill in Boston was as rude as stating that Madame's false eyebrow was about to fall off. But Lady Seymour was the wealthy, elderly widow of a British lord, incapable of social error, so all pretended she had not said a word. Several men cleared their throats and reached for their wine. Madame lifted her goblet. "I am told there are plans to reopen the John Street Theatre," she said loudly. "This heralds a return to civilization and order." Her eyebrow flopped into the rice pudding. The man seated to her right coughed loudly into his napkin. The wine steward's face turned the color of a plum, and a serving girl bit down on her lip to prevent a laugh. Madame avoided looking at her pudding. "A toast," she said with a wobbling voice. "A toast to civilization," Lockton added. "I've heard plans for a cricket club, too." As the men roared in approval, I carried the tray loaded with the dirty supper dishes down the stairs. On my return trip upstairs, I carried 2 pots of coffee. My trips up and down the stairs continued until my knees threatened to fold up and quit, bringing dishes down, carrying more delicacies and hot drinks up, 100 miles of stairs in one night. As the candles guttered out and were replaced with new, Madame and Lady Seymour retired to their bedchambers, and Lockton's business companions left to play billiards at the King's Head Tavern. The officers requested more coffee, lit their pipes, and unrolled their maps across the tablecloth, stained now with splashes of turtle soup, butter, wine, and candle wax. The serving girls moved down to the kitchen, where kettles of water were put on to boil for the washing of the dishes. The cook was long departed, and Sarah dozed on a kitchen chair, her swollen feet propped up on a pillow. I picked up the enormous bowl of table scraps and headed out the back door. Miss Mary Finch always mixed table scraps with muck and spread the smelly mess on her garden come spring, but the Locktons weren't much for growing things, not when the markets were so close to hand. Scraps here were dumped down the privy. I closed the door behind me and stopped. The cold air took my breath away. The sky was a black curtain, the stars ice chips whittled by an old knife. I wrapped up the shawl tighter across my shoulders and pulled it high to protect my neck. Through the kitchen window I could see 2 of the women squabbling about who would wash and who would dry. The second-floor windows glowed with candlelight, shadowed by the shapes of the officers circling around the map. I shuddered and my teeth banged together. Water would turn solid tonight. It was a bad night to be without a blanket. Would they truly allow prisoners to freeze to death? The soldier wives stopped arguing, and the men lit fresh candles. The stars wheeled above me, and inside, deep inside, something turned. I could not name it nor recognize its form. I drew in a cold breath and blew it skyward. The air came out of me in the shape of a cloud. It drifted above the rooftop and dissolved into the stars. Would they let him starve? The stars said not a word. The back door banged open and I jumped. "Don't tarry," said Sarah. "You need to dry the last of them glasses afore you lay yourself to sleep." "Yes, ma'am, as soon as I finish this." I quickly carried the scraps bowl out into the yard, walking past the privy all the way back to the stable wall where scraggly holly bushes grew. I glanced quick at the house to make sure no one was watching. then pulled aside the prickly branches of the bush and set the bowl down within it. I covered the bowl with my apron. On my way back to the house, I loaded my arms with firewood. I doubted she'd notice that I left the bowl outside, not with me bringing in extra wood. I took another deep breath of the frozen air before I opened the door, confused that I should be so awake after such a long day. I frowned as my thoughts tumbled and multiplied. I had been invaded. A dim plan had hatched itself in my brain pan without my consent, and I did not much like it.